We've covered a lot of ground so far in the techniques we've learned within the context of Vue.js, from talking about reactive data properties to list rendering, conditional rendering, directives, event listening, computer properties, watchers, so on and so forth. There's other things we've covered as well. And we've covered it all in a bit of a mishmash of examples. So I'd like to pause here, and instead of adding new topics to our plate, I want to pull all the pieces together and build a functioning application with what we know so far. And as I mentioned at the start of the series, what we want to do is we want to build this FlashWord application. And I've actually got a live demo running of what we hope to accomplish by the end of this video. So you can see when we come to the page, we're presented with 3 words in this little card interface. And we can go ahead and enter the correct translation of the word. And then the way we check each word is we just hit enter. And if it's correct, it turns to a green box and the little text input goes away. And you can see as I answer each card, we have a counter up here telling us how many words we've gotten correct. And then once we've answered all the words correct, we get this global feedback up top letting us know it's been completed. Other features of note is that anytime you come to the application or if you refresh the page and it presents you with the words, it's going to do so in a random order. And currently I only have it showing 3 words just for the purposes of the demo, and testing it makes it very quick to answer all the words and test this completed state. But obviously now that this is working, we could expand on this. We could pull in more words. We could have 10 words, 100 words, however many we wanted to actually make this useful. But for the prototype, 3 words is enough to demonstrate that all the features are working. So that's our end goal. Coming back to the notes, if you are following along, the first thing I'm going to do to set up this example is clear out any of the existing functionality I've built into my FlashWord application so far. So let me go ahead and go through that process. So coming down here, I'm actually going to just completely wipe this app div clear. I'm also going to get rid of any of my internal styles. I'm going to be pulling in some external styles here in a moment. And then over in my JavaScript, I'll start with a blank slate for my data properties. Same thing for my computer properties, my watchers, and my methods. I'll clear all of that out. And in terms of things that I'm keeping, I'm still keeping the overarching structure of initializing this application. So I've got my options. I've got my line down here that's creating my Vue app instance. It's getting my options. We are still mounting it to the element with the ID app, which we still have in our HTML. Of course, we're still pulling in Vue from our external CDN currently. We're still linking in our external JavaScript. Basically, all of the initial setup we did, we want to leave that as is and build upon it. All right. The other thing I want to do for setup, like I said, I've got some external CSS I want to pull from. So if you also want your example to look like mine, you can get this from the notes. I've got a link to some CSS we can pull in. And to grab a copy of this, we can click this little raw button just to get straight to the text. I'll select all of that. And then coming back to my application, I will create a new file, styles.css. I'll paste that in. And then back in my HTML, I will add a style tag that will link in that style sheet. And if you want to take a moment, you can skim through those styles just to get a sense of what I have in here. Just a bunch of classes and IDs that we'll be using as we build out our interface. Including here, you can see I've got some styling to apply to that app div where we're mounting Vue. And what I want is everything on the page to be centered within that. So actually coming back to my template, I want to take our H1, which is currently outside of that, and I'm just going to move it in there just so it'll be centered with the rest of the content. All right, so with that set up, let me load this in my browser. So I'll be ready to preview it once we start adding our features. So I'll just add a new tab and quickly locate that. And that looks good. That's our starting point. So building on this, I think our first order of business is to set up some data within this application, specifically the words that we're going to present to the visitor. And to expedite this, I went ahead and put together an array of words that we can pull in. I've set it up as an array of objects. So each object is the details for a given word. Within there, we have 2 properties for the word that we're going to show the user, and then the expected answer. All right, so basically the Spanish word and the English word. I also have a data property for each of the words to store a hint. This is not something we're actually going to see in our final version in this video, but it is something down at the end. I have some bonus challenges you can practice with. One of the things is to give the user the option to see that hint, so that exists if we need it. The other properties I have for each of the words is an answer property that is going to store whatever answer the user is typing in for that particular word, and then a Boolean value for correct, true or false, whether or not they got it correct or not. All right, so let's pull this in as our first data property. All right, and everything looks good there. We've got it in the correct location, correct indentation. I will note at this point that this isn't super ideal because this is a fair amount of data that we're now having to put directly in our JavaScript. I think in future iterations of this, it would be better if our words were coming from something like a database, or even if we had them in like an external JSON file that we imported. That would just make things a little bit neater. But for this first stab at it, just encoding the words directly in our JavaScript, I think is sufficient. So building on this, now that we've got our words, the next logical thing to do would be to output them on the page. To do this, though, I'm not going to just directly output words because I want to show the words in a random order each time. So I'm going to create a computed property that's going to shuffle my words, and that's what I'm going to iterate through. So coming down to our computed property section, let's define a new computed property. I'm going to call it shuffled words. And this is going to return our words, but we're going to shuffle them. So we're going to use a sort method on this, just a built-in JavaScript method, not Vue specific. And the algorithm we're going to use to sort it is going to look like this. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how this is actually doing the sorting, because in all honesty, whenever I need to randomly sort an array in JavaScript, I just go to Google and I type in randomly sort array JavaScript, and usually it takes me over to a Stack Overflow post and I find the solution that looks the cleanest, and that's exactly what I did here. So if you want to know more than that, feel free to reach out and we can dig deeper into it, but it's not really the thing we're focused on here. The main thing we just need is to get this array shuffled, and this line of code will do that for us. All right, so now that we have that, let's switch over to our template, and what we want to do is we want to iterate through that computed property, displaying each of our words. And structurally, the way I'm going to set this up is I'll start with an outer div, which I'll give an ID of cards. And the reason I'm giving it that particular ID is if we go back to the styles, you can see I've got some styling going on for an ID cards where I'm doing some CSS grid work so we can display each word in like a little card box that will show up in columns. The other style I have predefined here is a class for card, which we'll use for the individual divs within this that contains each of the words. So actually, let's set that up next. So within here, we'll create a div for each word. We'll apply the class card. And then we're going to use the v-for directive to generate multiple of these. And what we're going to be iterating through to get all of our words is going to be that shuffle words computer property that we just created. So I'm going to say for word in shuffled words, and then we'll text interpolate the word to the page. But specifically, if we just do word here, this is going to give us the full object, which if we look back at our data structure, we have several parts for each word. Really what we want here is just the Spanish word, which is represented by this word underscore a data property. So that's what we want to reference. So I'll just use our dot notation to get that property from that object. And that should be enough. Let's test this out, making sure that our words are output to the page. And excellent. There's our 3 words. Output in their little card elements with the appropriate styles. And of course, if I refresh this, we should see it giving us a random order each time. So building on this, let's next add our inputs where the user can enter their answer. So right after our word, I will add a basic text input. And I'm going to model this after the answer property for the given word. All right, so just looking back at our data structure again, we have each of our words and we have this answer property within there that defaults to an empty string. This is what we're going to attach to the inputs. The other thing we'll need is an event listener so that after the user enters their answer, they can hit the enter key and that'll prompt it to check their answer. So we'll use our v-on directive there, listen for a key up, specifically the enter key. And then when they do this, let's create a method. We'll call it check answer. And when we invoke this method, which I'll define here in a moment, we're going to need to pass over the given word we're checking. All right, this is a little different than our examples up to this point where we're only dealing with a single word. We could just invoke check answer. Now we have to be more specific. We have to say, okay, what word are we checking the answer for? So I'm just going to pass that along to this method. All right, so now switching over to our JavaScript, let's set up that method. And we will define it so it's expecting a word. And what it's going to want to do is it's going to, for the given word that we're checking the answer for, it's going to want to toggle this property correct to either true or false, depending upon whether the answer that the user has entered matches the word be, which is the English translation. So to write that, we're going to reference word, which is being passed in. We're going to reference that correct data property. And we're going to set it to a Boolean expression that's going to compare word B with the answer. And then to check that this is working, let's use this correct property as part of our interface. So the way I had shown in the demo is once they get the word correct, we actually don't see the input anymore. You just see the correct answer. So what I'll do is I'll use a VIF directive here, and I'm going to say if it's not correct, then we'll see the input. Otherwise, we're just going to output the correct answer. And what I'm outputting here is the answer because we can assume we're only going to see this if the answer is correct. The other thing I could do is just output word B because we know that's the correct answer. At this point, both of those should have the same value. So let's test this out. All right, so there's our inputs, and I'm going to enter the correct answer. I'm going to hit the enter key, and excellent. It got rid of the text input, and it's just outputting the correct answer. And we can confirm it's working for our other inputs as well. All right, so with the basics of that working, let's address some styling. What I'd like to do is, once they get the correct answer, I want to turn the little card green. To facilitate this, if we look back at the style sheet, I have a class that we can apply here, correct. I also have a class for the correct answer paragraph just to remove the margin and padding, just to tighten up the design a little bit. So let's address these. And where I want to apply the correct class is actually to the outer div of the card itself, because you can see it's going to turn the background color of that div green. But of course, we only want to conditionally display this if it's correct. So this is a good opportunity to apply what we talked about with the vbind attribute, where we will bind a CSS class, and we'll use the object syntax here, which, you'll recall, the way we set this up is the property is the class that we want to potentially apply. In this case, that's correct. And then the value should be some Boolean expression that's going to indicate whether that class is going to be applied. So in this case, what we're looking at is whether word.correct is true. So we're just going to reference that. All right, so if word.correct is true, then the class correct will be applied to this element. And this line's starting to get a little bit long, so I'll just break the attributes out onto their own line just so we can clearly read everything that's going on here. And then down here on the paragraph is where we want to apply that class correct answer. And I'm not doing any sort of v-binding with the class here just because there's no conditional here. Basically, if this paragraph is displaying, we do want it to have this class correct answer. Let's check out these improvements. Perfect. So that looks good. I think there was another class I also had for the word itself that made it bold, just to distinguish it from the answer. So let's add that as well. Yeah, there we go. So there's that class word I want to add. And I want this to look similar to the correct answer. So I'm also going to add a padding and margin of 0 to this. All right, so let's apply that, wrap it around our word in a paragraph element, and check it out one more time. And that looks pretty good. I think my browser is currently zoomed in. If I zoom out, you can see what it'll look like at 100%. It looks a little bit more balanced. All right, so that's the baseline functionality of showing the words, allowing the user to enter the answer and checking it. So now let's add some of those finishing touches we saw in the demo. Things like at the top of the page, after we've completed all the words, we get this feedback message. And then when we're in the uncompleted state, we have this live counter up top telling us how many words we still have to guess. All right, now to facilitate this, the first thing I want to do is I need to get a count of how many words we're challenging the user to guess. And obviously in this basic example, I know what that is. I know it's 3 words. I could just hard code it as 3. But remember, this is just our prototype. We're working with 3 words. Ultimately, it would be nice to have more words. And maybe it's pulling from a database and we don't actually know how many words are there. Long story short, we want the application to calculate how many words we're working with. So to make that happen, let's go back to our JavaScript. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a computed property that's going to count how many words are in our data set. So after our shuffled words computed property, let's add a word count computed property. And this simply just needs to return a length count of our words data property. And I do want to note here, it's important we're doing this as a computed property. If we tried to set this up as, say, a regular data property, let's say we did something like this, word count is set to this words.length, this would not work. And in fact, I'll go ahead and show this. So let me comment out my computed property. We're going to try this as a data property and we'll see how it's going to fail. So let me go back to this is the finished demo. I'm going to switch back to our active demo here. And I'm going to refresh it. And you can see we get an error. Cannot read properties of undefined. It's trying to read length, and basically it's saying it can't read length of this dot words because at this stage in setting things up, this words is not available yet, right? Even though, we put this after we set up the words here, the way that this instance is set up by Vue, we can't reference other data properties when setting data properties. All right, so anytime you're in this sort of situation, computer properties are going to be the way to get a job like this done. All right, so let's clean that up. And to confirm that this is working as expected, let's go back to our template. And at the very top, we'll have a paragraph that says you have answered X out of, and this is where we'll output our word count computer property. And right now I've just put X here as a placeholder. We'll address this in a moment. We'll come up with some data to track how many words they've gotten correct. But right now we just want to make sure that word count is working as expected. All right, excellent. So there is the 3 as expected. I'll go ahead and zoom in on this again so we can see that better. All right, so with that working, now let's address, we need to keep track of how many correct answers they've gotten. And the way that we can do this, let's go back to our JavaScript. I think what we should do is maybe piggyback on our check answer method. And every time they get a correct answer, we could have a counter that will increment to keep track of how many correct answers we have. So to facilitate that, let's first set up a data property to keep track of how many correct answers they have. So I'll just add this after my words. Let's call it correct count, and I'll initialize it as 0. And then down here, we'll use just a basic if statement. We'll say if word is correct, then we will increment our correct count. All right, and then coming back to our template, we can output that right here. All right, so it starts off at 0, and then every time we got get a correct answer, it should increment it by 1. And excellent, that looks good. All right, so now the final thing we want to do is we just want to swap out this message once they've gotten all the words correct. We want to have a message saying, congratulations, they've completed it. So for this, couple different ways I could go about this, but I want to take advantage of the watchers that we were talking about in the previous video. So I'm going to set up a watcher that's going to watch this correct count value. And then once it matches our total word count computed property, then we know the game is completed and we could get this message to swap out. All right, so let's set this up. Let's go back to our JavaScript and I'm going to set up a watcher. And remember, we always name our watchers after the thing we're watching. So in this case, we're watching correct count. So that's what we're going to call our watcher. And then within here, we're going to be checking for whether our correct count data property is equivalent to our word count computed property. And then once it is, let's set up a data property. We'll call it completed, which on initial page load, we'll set it to false. But then once these two values match, we'll toggle it to true. And I'll go ahead and initialize this up here as one of our data properties. Another way we could write this instead of having a full if statement is we could just set completed to be a check of this Boolean expression. All right, so if these values match, completed will be set to true. Otherwise, if they don't, it'll remain false. And that's just a little bit cleaner. It's 1 line instead of 3. So now let's put this completed data property to use in our template. And what we'll do is we'll have another paragraph that if completed is true, we'll display that. Otherwise, we'll display this current paragraph that we have. And I think I have some IDs we can apply to these 2 paragraphs for styling purposes. If we look down at the styles, we have a correct count and a completed ID we can apply. Let's see how this looks. So there's our initial state, and I'll go ahead and complete the words. And excellent, you can see our global message toggled and everything is working as expected. And with that, that's as far as we're going to take FlashWord in this video. Hopefully this was a nice summary of all the concepts we've been looking at up until this point. A couple resources to leave you with. If you're following along in the notes, I do have a link to the final code for this example. You can find it over on GitHub. I also have some bonus challenges at the end if you want some additional practice to apply these skills we've been working with. But as for where we're going next in this series, I would consider this kind of the end of our intro foundational stuff with Vue. Starting with the next part, we're going to take things up a notch and start thinking bigger picture with our applications. For example, we're going to talk about things called components, which is going to provide a useful way to organize and really modularize the parts of our applications. And to take full advantage of that, we're going to want to also introduce a build system as part of our development process. Long story short, we still have a lot of important ground to cover, so I hope you will continue to watch along.